Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started here. And what we're going to look at first is I'm going to take the ones with the most votes, and I'm going to just go by unit. And so there's only one of them that got votes from all 13 people, and that's the Z scores. So I'll make sure I'm pretty clear about what we're covering. Z scores won't take that long anyway. So if you're taking notes or doing whatever you do, I'll give you a moment to kind of get things set up, and then I will get going on this. All right, so Z scores. Z scores have to do with statistics when we look at research data. Um, Basically, the Z score is how many standard deviations a given data point is from the average. So if you're looking at that normally distributed curve and the average, the mean, the median, the mode is right down the center. And the standard deviation, let's call it 5. That means that the first standard deviation is 5 above and it's 5 below. And then, the second standard deviation would be the next 5 above and the next 5 below. So let's say that you got the average is 60. And that's where, and it's a normally distributed curve. And so it's directly in the center. And the standard deviation is 5. If the average is 60 for that one, and the standard deviation is 5, and you say, okay, a data point is at 50. What's the Z score? The Z score would be 2, because obviously 50 is 10 less than 60. And if the standard deviation is 5, that means it's 2 standard deviations away. So the Z score refers to the number of standard deviations that a data point is from the mean or the average. And the standard deviation should be given to you guys, by the way, too. You shouldn't have to calculate standard deviation. How did I get 2? Okay, so you know what? Let me see if I can do something with the whiteboard real quick. I actually never use this, so we'll see if this works. Okay, so I'm going to do a real rough drawing here, just so that that you guys can see. But if we've got a normally distributed curve, there we go. And let's say our average is, let's say that's 50. All right. Sorry for my terrible computer penmanship. And let's say you have a data point and your data point is 60 here. And they say, what's the Z score? If the standard deviation equals 5. Wow, that's a terrible 5. Oh my God, that looks awful. So if the standard deviation is 5, all right, that means that if a data point was at 55, it would be 1 standard deviations away. If a data point was at 60, it would be 2 standard deviations away, because each one of this is 1 standard deviation. So 1 standard deviation from 50, if it's 5, would be from 45 to 55. 2 standard deviations would be from 40 to 60. So if the data point is 60, then there's 1 standard deviation right here and another one right here. And that would be then 2. Did that answer your question, Zaina? Okay, perfect. All right, I'm going to quit this whiteboard because it looks terrible. All right, so that is the Z score. All right, there are a number of ones with 12 votes, so we're going to go through those ones next. There are two of them in research methods, so I'm going to do those first. The first one is empiricism, and this is going to take you about 5 seconds. So prior to psychology, this is about like even before the earliest schools of psychology, but it's kind of like the precursor to what the science of psychology is all about. Prior to psychology even becoming a science, before we could get there, in a time in like the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, they developed an idea called empiricism. Empiricism, or using empirical research, uses data to prove cause and effect relationships. Prior to that, they just kind of guessed. If it looked like it caused a relationship, if something looked like it was correlated, they took it as fact. Empiricism, or using empirical research, is research that involves data to prove an idea. And without empiricism, you don't get any of that psychological research that comes later that starts the study, the science, and continues it and makes it as it is today. Questions on empiricism? All right. Okay. So the next one with 12 votes in research methods was P scores. And that's another important one. So Z scores and P scores both got really high votes, because obviously you look at a letter and a score and you're like, I don't know what that means. So the P score. The P score is the amount that results from an experiment come from confounding variables. So, as you know, using random assignment will help eliminate the effects of confounding variables. Hopefully, you know that. If you don't, now you know. And, but obviously, even when you have random assignment, there's still going to be some data uh, that's going to be connected, that's going to still come from that confounding variables, from those additional things that aren't part of the variables in the research. But as long as it's a very small amount of data that comes from confounding variables, it's okay. It makes it statistically significant. So the P score looks at statistical significance and how much of the research data comes from confounding variables. And for psychology, we want our P score to be less than or equal to 0.05. So less than or equal to 0.05. Why 0.05? Because that then would suggest that only 5% or less of the data comes from those confounding variables. If it's 95% or more that comes from the experiment, then we can say, yes, it has statistical significance. Yeah, it's kind of like the margin of error, but it's more tied in. It's still part of the, and it's, forgive me by the way if it's been a long time since I took a stats course, so please keep that in mind. But it's still part of the research data, so it still can be included as the overall results. Is not something that you can kind of that you would put on the side. It's just that there's not enough of it to really have a significant impact on the provability of your experiment. Good. All right. Okay, so now we're going to take our first 12 vote topic from development. There was nothing in learning with 12 votes. So we're going to go ahead and look at Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development. So with Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development, okay, thank you. Um, with Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development, this is about how kids develop their cognitive skills through interaction with the environment. Obviously, by its title, there are four distinct stages. Each one of these has a general rough age range, but what we really see is that each one of these stages has a specific set of kind of characteristics that go along with it. And so Piaget learned this by doing a lot of research on Swiss and French children and interviewing them and seeing kind of what skills they had at different ages. So the first stage is known as the sensory motor stage. I'm going to write that in the chat. Oh, the sensory motor stage. And the sensory motor stage is basically infancy to about age 3, give or take. In this stage, you have a couple distinct characteristics developing kind of as the infants progress within this stage to toddlerhood. And one of them is object permanence. Object permanence comes at about around 6 months. And that's when an object is covered or put out of sight. The child knows that it's still there. Prior to that, when an object is covered up, a child literally thinks that it disappears. Another characteristic in this stage is like infant basic logic, like I drop a spoon and mom and dad pick it up. But this stage is primarily called this stage because it involves the use of a child's sensory skills and their motor skills, manipulating of objects, moving it around, touching it, feeling it, looking at it, and so on. Oftentimes, Piaget talked about the reason why kids put things in their mouth is not because they want to eat it, but because they want to explore with it. Nah, exactly. Yeah, so they're trying to explore with it instead. All right, the second stage is known as the preoperational stage. This stage is somewhere between like 3 to 6. Maybe 3 to 7, something like that. And in the preoperational stage, we see a couple of key characteristics. One is egocentrism. Now, egocentric is not just that they want things for themselves, that kids want things for themselves, but it's that they literally can only view things from their own perspective. At this point, kids don't have empathy skills. They can only see it from the way they see it. I think during class, I told you the story about the kid where you're like, is that your brother? And the kid says, yes. And they say, what's his name? And he says, Matthew. And then they go, does Matthew have a brother? And the kid says, no. Because they can't view themselves as a brother because they can't view it from Matthew's perspective. I think part of it. I also think part of it they haven't totally developed the social norms that are necessary. Where you may not totally tell the complete honest truth to people because it kind of hurts them sometimes. Yeah. The other key characteristic during this stage is animism. And animism is where things are brought to life. So things that are inanimate and they're brought to life. So like dolls and toys and stuffed animals and things like that. Yeah, basically personification, but specifically with things that they have developed somewhat of a connection to. All right, the third stage is called the formal operational stage. This goes from about ages 7-ish to about 11. The formal operational stage. Wait, no, sorry. I'm so sorry. That's the fourth stage. Sometimes I get the stages mixed up too. It is the concrete operational stage. I apologize for that, you guys. Formal operational is the fourth stage. Fake news, right? So the concrete operational stage, stage three. All right, we're good with that now. The concrete operational stage is all about. That's when you see things like conservation, which is the estimation of mass and volume, even though there's different shapes. In the previous stage, the pre-operational stage, a kid can't do conservation, but when they get to the concrete operational stage, they can. So when you see two different size glasses with two different widths, you don't just say that the one where the liquid is taller is more because it might be skinnier. The other key concept that's developed during this time is mathematical transformation. And mathematical transformation is when you have something like 3 plus 2 equals 5, and then what does 5 minus 3 equal? We know that we can just substitute and move the numbers around. That's that transformation. In stage 3, this is when kids develop it. Concrete operational stage. It's rough, but about ages 7 to 11. Mm-hmm. And then the final stage is the formal operational stage. This is where you see things like abstract thought, advanced logical skills, and potentially individual moral codes, but not always. And this stage would be like 11 or like 12 to 14. So advanced logical skills, abstract thought, potential moral reasoning, or the development of a moral code. Not all kids will get this in time. Some of them will get it later in adolescence. All right, that's Piaget. That one's a big one. Are there any questions about Piaget? I guarantee you will need to know Piaget, just so you know. Guaranteed. You will need to know the distinctions between the stages, and you'll need to probably know the names too. Okay. So we hit all the ones with 12 votes out of the possible 13. Let's start hitting the ones with 11. And again, I'm going to be doing it kind of like research methods with 11, learning with 11, and then development with 11. And then I'll just keep going. All right. Looks like there isn't any in research methods with 11. So that's good. Um, in learning, there's not any with 11. There is, however, in development. Okay, so the next two that we're going to be doing is Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial development and Kohlberg's 6 stages of moral development. So we're going to be just knocking out the stages right now. All right, Erickson's going to take a little while, but hopefully we can move through the stages relatively quickly. So with Erickson and his 8 stages of psychosocial like development or conflict, uh, you absolutely need to know the name of like the verses. You probably saw it on the exam that we took for development, where it's just like ego integrity versus despair, or industry versus inferiority, or things like that. Or sometimes it may just even ask about one part of it as well, like inferiority or industry or something like that. So you do need to know these names, and I know it's a lot, and I'm sorry it's a lot. It just is what it is. So let's go through it. All right. So stage 1 is infancy. So these are basically 8 psychosocial conflicts, or 8 social conflicts that an individual goes through as they develop through the stages of their life. And as they resolve this conflict, it'll be to either one side or another. And then they will carry that trait or characteristic with them for the rest of their life. All right. So stage 1, infancy, is trust versus mistrust. Ooh, I may forget some of the names of these conflicts. I always forget one or two. So stage 1 is trust versus mistrust, and with stage 1, it's all about is an infant's needs met. What are you all manning about? That I forget something? No, I only did the first. Yeah, I'm like I only did the first one. I can't miss that yet. Nice. Okay, thank you. All right. So that's basically, does an infant get its needs met? Of course, the prenatal stage. That's a different bullet point on the form. So there you go. All right. Stage 2, which is ages 1 to 3, is autonomy versus shame. So autonomy versus shame is basically like, can a toddler learn to do things on their own? Will they develop that autonomy where they can do things on their own, or will they be kind of shameful to always be reliant on a caregiver or mom and dad or something like that? This is where a kid is learning to like put on their clothes and stuff like that, brush their hair, brush their teeth, go to the bathroom properly, all of that. Stage 3 is initiative versus guilt. And with this one, it's basically, um, can a kid learn to kind of like play together? Uh, do they learn like they understand the purpose of things? Do they take then the initiative to try to like help out or play games or be social or things like that? Or do they not, and then they feel guilty because they're not doing what other people are doing? That age range is like 3 to 6. All right, stage 4 is industry versus inferiority, and that's approximately ages 6 to like 11. Um, Probably not, Zaina, but you should have at least a general reference of like, where is it referred to, young kids or older kids or young adults or middle adults or so on. I don't think you need to know the numbers, but it could help to be like I've seen like a general idea. Like I've seen like an FRQ question that mentioned adolescence, and certainly they talked about, one of the bullet points was Erickson, And so you would have had to like either mention intimacy versus isolation, or identity versus role confusion. So something like that, so you know that those are the general things that occur during adolescence and early adulthood. So yeah, I'd say more of a general idea rather than specific numbers. Yeah, for sure. All right, so stage four, industry versus inferiority, is this is basically when a child will take pride in their accomplishments, and then will keep working at it to get better, or they will just feel like they're just not good enough. All right, stage five is identity versus role confusion. And this takes place during early and middle adolescence, sometimes even into later adolescence. And it's basically when a person learns to develop their own sense of self. This is where you get a lot of like experimentation and finding out what kind of person an individual is. And this can be anything from the behaviors they carry out to the clothes that they wear to the music they listen to and so on. Stage six, which is later adolescence until about through early adulthood, would be intimacy versus isolation. And this is basically, does a person learn to form intimate, loving relationships with other people, or will they be isolated and not have any sort of social connection? Stage seven, which is middle adulthood, is generativity versus stagnation. And this is the idea that adults need to create or nurture things that are going to outlast them, either by having children or creating a positive change, or things that benefit other people, or having success within their own career, their own their interests and their purposes. Because when you're successful, it makes an adult feel like that they're useful and accomplished. And failure is basically just kind of like, I'm just kind of here in the world and I'm just kind of going. And the final stage of Erickson is stage eight, ego integrity versus despair. And this is the elderly stage, and it involves reflection on an individual's life, and whether or not they're happy with what occurred, felt like their life had purpose, or not. Ego integrity versus despair. I'll put that in the chat. Oh yeah, no, well, a lot of these are really sad if you think about it, Logan. I mean, if you think about like generativity versus stagnation, like an adult that just kind of like goes to work and just kind of like goes through and wakes up each and every day, but doesn't feel like they're accomplished or successful, like that's totally that's totally sad. Or like industry versus inferiority, where a person carries an inferiority complex because they don't feel like they can put the effort because they'll never be successful. Right, like all of that, like there's a lot of really, like if you look at the like negative outcomes of some of these stages, there's a lot of really really kind of sad things that happen, but that's why it's the conflict, right? That's why it's the defining conflict of each age stage, which really shows the overall social development of an individual. All right, questions here? Yeah, I would say of the development stuff, the hard most of it is pretty easy. The hardest part are just the like discerning between all the different stages with all the different people. All right, so we're going to do our last stage one, for, at least for right now. And we're going to do Kohlberg's 6 stages of moral development. Now, remember with Kohlberg, it's not really defined by age like the way some of the other ones were. It's more on, the perception of the behavior, whether or not it's morally correct or not, based on the stage of thinking that that person has, that stage of moral reasoning that that person is going through. So with Kohlberg, I don't. You pretty much don't need to know the specific stage 1 through 6, but you do need to know the difference and kind of the subtle differences within each one between the three kind of main parts of Kohlberg, being the pre-conventional, the conventional, and post-conventional. So you definitely need to know the difference between the three of them. And even within each one, you need to kind of know the difference that takes place between like stage 1 and 2 in pre-conventional, and stage 3 and 4 in conventional, and so on. So I'll tell you the names, but I don't think you really need to know it. But you do need to know kind of the main kind of three that they have there. Okay, so the pre-conventional stages are kind of like our earliest moral reasoning, and a lot of it is very kind of it's based on that idea of egocentrism, that a child can only look at things from their own perspective and what happens to them. So stage 1 is all about rewards and punishments. With stage 1, if somebody gets caught, then it's wrong, and if they don't get caught, then it's morally correct. I always use the example, if I speed down the highway and I don't get caught, I don't really see it as wrong because I'm using stage 1 moral reasoning for that reasoning of whether or not it's right or wrong. Stage 2 looks at whether or not a behavior or an action will benefit that individual. So, or someone that the individual is close to. So if you look at an action, let's say like stealing, and it benefits the person because they get something new, well, in stage 2 reasoning, that's morally correct because it's beneficial to them. Or if it helps, let's say, their friends or family, it would be morally correct. But if it helps someone random and it's kind of like something wrong, like stealing, and doesn't benefit the individual, then they would view it as wrong. The second set is conventional. And conventional moral reasoning is based on what other people tell us, whether it's individuals or whether it's society. So stage 3 is other individuals we're close to telling us that it's something is morally correct or morally wrong. Like your family, your parents telling you that's wrong or that's right. And then you base your moral reasoning on whether or not your family says it's right or wrong for stage 3. For stage 4, we expand that to society. And if society says that something is wrong, they'll make a law that makes it illegal. So when we say, I can't do that, or you shouldn't do that because that's illegal, that's using stage 4 moral reasoning. Because society has termed it to be wrong. Society has created a social norm that says that's a wrong thing to do. See, now I can talk about social norms and you guys know what I'm talking about. Yeah, But then they wouldn't look at, so with stage one, it's like they would look at an action even if it's illegal, but if they don't get caught, then they would say that then that's okay. Stage three is when your friends or family tell you that something is either right or wrong. That's how you define right and wrong. Stage four is society. Yeah, so I think you see, Logan, with stage one, it's all about whether or not the individual is caught in the act and is then told that that's wrong. With stage four, we can already say that's wrong whether they got caught or not because society has determined it to be wrong. Yes, like speeding. Exactly. So if you say you shouldn't drive more than 65 miles an hour on the freeway, Mr. Levine, because it's illegal, then yet you would be using stage four moral reasoning. You're welcome. All right, and then stage five and six are the post-conventional stages. And this is where an individual develops their own moral code. Advanced moral reasoning, we would call it. And Piaget would say that this doesn't happen until at least the formal operational stage or till early adolescence. Kohlberg would probably agree as well. Stage five is what we call the social contract. And in stage five, it's all about, yes, laws are there for the benefit of the society as a whole, but sometimes a law doesn't serve to benefit an individual. And if breaking that law will then help that individual in a way that's going to make, their like save their life or something like that, then we would say that it's morally correct to break the law. So stage five acknowledges that you should mostly follow the law, like stage four, but if there's something that's really going to be, protect an individual from harm in some way, then breaking the law is not only acceptable, but it's also morally correct. Yes, absolutely. That's a really good example, Logan. And then stage six is what we call the universal ethics principle. And stage six is all about determining your own view of right and wrong, not based on society, not based on family, not based on rewards and punishment, but your own view of, is this wrong? And usually empathy plays a really, really strong role in determining whether or not you view something as either right or wrong. Like if I was in that place, would I want that done to me? Would it be okay if that was done to me if I was in that place? All right, questions here. We hit a lot of the stage ones, the big stage ones. All right. So now we finished the 11 vote ones, and we're going to go into the 10 vote ones. Okay. So in research methods, there's only two topics that have 10 votes out of the 13, and they both involve statistics. And it involves the normally distributed curve and positively and negatively distributed curves. So let's do those together because it makes sense, right? All right. In a normally distributed curve, the mean, the median, the mode is all exactly in the center. So in college courses, when they curve the class, or on the AP exam, when they use a normally distributed curve to curve the exam, uh, the mean, the median, the mode will be directly in the center. We need to know with our normally distributed curve that 68% of all scores in that normally distributed curve fall within one standard deviation of the mean of the center. "95% of all scores fall within 2 standard deviations, either above or below the mean. So remember that with this normally distributed curve, the numbers that they give you, like the mean is 23 and the standard deviation is 2 or something like that, that's all relative. What we're looking at here is percentages. So no matter what the number for the mean, median, mode is, no matter what the standard deviation given is, it will always be 68% of the scores within 1 standard deviation and 95% of the scores within 2. And then 99.7% of all scores fall within 3. And I don't know if you guys remember the mnemonic from the beginning of the year, but let me repeat it for you. There's a 6 and an 8-year-old, right? 68, that are going to visit their grandma for her 95th birthday. See, we got the 68, we've got the 95. And she says she wants to listen to the oldies station because it's her birthday and she gets to listen to the music of her youth. So she turns it on to radio station 99.7. And they listen to oldies and eat cake. I just added that last part in, but you would expect that they would eat cake if it's her birthday. Now, in the positively and negatively skewed curves, this is when the mean, the median, and the mode are not directly equal. This is when there's an abundance of either high scores or low scores. Now, if there's an abundance of low scores, yeah, no worries, no worries. You can kind of catch whatever you miss on the recording. You're welcome. When there's an abundance of low scores, we would say that that curve is positively skewed. Because even though there are an abundance of low scores, there will be some high scores that bring that mean up, which makes it positively skewed. Because the mean then is higher than the median in the mode. And obviously, if the reverse occurs, if there's an abundance of high scores, we would say that it's negatively skewed, because even though there's lots of high scores, there's still bound to be some low ones that's going to bring the mean down. And so it's going to skew it negatively. And remember, you don't even need to know the math stuff with that. You can look at the curve and look for the tail. Obviously, the big hump of it is that walrus or whale or whatever you want to call it. And then the low part where you have a lot less scores, that would be the tail on that curve. And it's always going to skew towards the tail. So if you don't want to think about the math part, that's another way to do it. All right, questions on these normally distributed curves and positively and negatively skewed? All right, good. We're going to hit our first learning topic now. The first one with 10 votes. There's actually 2 of them, and they're 2 of the studies. One is John Watson, and one is Edward Thorndike. So John Watson's study is the Little Albert study. John Watson, also, we should know, is the father of behaviorism, one of those early schools of psychology. And John Watson wanted to prove that classical conditioning can exist in people. So he proved that little Albert, this 1-year-old baby, liked furry things like rats and dogs and rabbits and stuff like that. And then he brought in a steel bar and hit it with a hammer while little Albert was holding that white rat. And he did it a bunch of times, actually 6 is I think what he did. Obviously, in this case, the unconditioned stimulus is hitting the loud bar with a hammer. And the unconditioned response would be fear. Now, what happened, obviously, is that little Albert's brain made an association between the touch of the white rat and the sound of that steel bar being hit with a hammer. So the touch of the white rat was neutral at first. But then when paired with hitting it with the steel hammer, all of a sudden, that white rat became a conditioned stimulus. And eventually, when the steel bar was removed and the white rat also caused the fear, then that would be the conditioned response. And so little Albert was able to learn fear. Kinda unethical. Just a little bit. But he got his mom's permission. So that's something. All right. Edward Thorndike's experiment was about the cat in the puzzle box. So basically, Edward Thorndike put this cat in like a cage, and with like a complex like set of like lever attachments. Basically, the cat had to flip like one thing up and then reach and flip a latch over. So it was like a multi-step thing. And what Thorndike did is he tested the cat to see how long it took when presented with potential rewards or presented with nothing. Now, when presented with nothing, the cat didn't even try. But obviously, at first, the cat was shown kind of how the doors opened and the latches looked, and then it was reclosed. And Edward Thorndike then put fish outside of the puzzle box. And obviously, the cat wanted the fish, so the cat started to try to figure out how to get the door open. And with each subsequent trial, it took less and less time. And so this was the first kind of ideas about operant conditioning. And while this certainly didn't use punishment on the operant conditioning side, it definitely used reinforcement. And it showed that with a reinforcer, a desired behavior will not only get more useful, no, not more useful, get more reliable, but it will occur quicker. Showing that these reinforcers, create or cause someone or something to do some sort of desired behavior. All right, we hit 2 of those. Any questions on Thorndike or Watson? All right. And there is nothing with 10 votes in development. So now we're going to go to the 9 vote things. And surprise, surprise, when we go back to research methods, we go back to statistics. The CS and CR for Watson, the conditioned stimulus would be the rat, the touch of the rat. And the CR would be the fear from the white rat. You're welcome. All right, so with histograms and standard deviation and variance, here's how I'm going to cover it. So I'm just going to briefly discuss these. I might need to do a drawing, I might not, but let's see if I can just describe it, or if I feel like it's not satisfactory, or you guys can tell me too. So with histograms, this is essentially like a bar graph, kind of. It is a visual way of showing, the the primary mode or the primary measures in statistics, which would be the mean, the median, the mode. So let's say that you were doing an experiment to see how fast 5 individuals ran. Your x-axis could be each individual, and the y-axis could be the time. Or no, how about each set of individuals? That makes it better, actually. Should we see it? Should we see a picture? Would this work better for people? Hit that raise a hand button if you need that. If you need a picture. Yep, looks like we're doing a picture. All right, thanks for your patience with this whole whiteboard thing, you guys. So a histogram is kind of like a bar graph, but not exactly. With a histogram, it's not just like an x-axis of numbers and the y-axis of numbers. It's more like there's categories within the histogram. So if we had 5 groups of people that each ran a mile, we could say that time, let me see if I can write well, could be the y-axis. And then the groups hey, handwriting's not so bad this time. The groups would be the x-axis. So you could have group 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now let's say we had groups of 10, doesn't matter how many we have, but we can look at the mean, the median, the mode, and visually show them through this. So let's say in group 1, the mean, the median, the mode were all the same. We would have 3 bars that are right next to each other. And this would be our measurements for group 1. And now let's say, however, though, that the mode is really low for group 2. And so... Shadow. Sorry, you guys. Hold on. Please. Abigail, come on.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Shadow, come here. Come on. Out.
Very nice. And so let's say the mode is really low for group 2, which then makes the median a little bit lower, and it makes the mean not too much lower than that. It would look something like that. And then let's say we had a mode was really high for the next one in terms of the numbers of, the mode being the number that occurs most frequently. And then so you have the median and then the mean. And so this is a way that we could show the measurements of each of these 3 measures for each of these individual groups. All right, are there any questions about this one? Okay, good. All right, so standard deviation is a measure of variance. What it does, there's 2 main measures of variance. We'll do the first one, the really easy one first, and that's the range. The range is a measure of variance. And essentially, the range is the difference between the highest score and the lowest score. So if you have a test or some scores of something, and the highest score is 50 and the lowest score is 10, then the range is 40. But standard deviation is the complicated one. If you look back in your notes, there's a whole formula on how to do standard deviation. You shouldn't have to use that. But here's what you should know about what a standard deviation is. The standard deviation is the average distance from a data point in a set to the mean. So it is the average distance from a data point to the mean. So obviously in a given data set, you're going to have a lot of different scores. Some will be really close to the average and some will be very far away. The standard deviation measures the average distance from all those different data points to the mean. No worries, Janelle. Hope you enjoy. All right, questions about that? Does that sound good, you guys? Does this make sense? I'm trying to do it in a way that's very simple and straightforward. All right, excellent then. Okay, next 9 votes. Nothing in learning with 9 votes. So let's go back to development. And let's talk about Lev Vygotsky. All right, so Lev Vygotsky, Russian psychologist, looked at how children develop cognitively. So in many ways, he's very similar to Piaget. So both Piaget and Vygotsky measure whether or not, thank you. Both Vygotsky and Piaget measure and look at the development of cognitive skills with children. But the difference is how they measure it. Obviously, we know already that with Piaget, it's all about interaction with the environment. But with Vygotsky, it's all about social interaction. Unlike Piaget, who has 4 distinct stages, Vygotsky doesn't really have a whole lot of stages outside of his language stages. It's more just a general idea of how kids develop cognitively. With Vygotsky, what ends up occurring is that he says that there's this thing called the zone of proximal development, the ZPD. The ZPD is the area between the things you can do and the things you can't. So obviously, like a kid might be able to do basic addition, but they can't do advanced calculus, even with help. The ZPD is that space in the middle between what they can do and what they can't. And this is the stuff that they can do, but only with assistance. Assistance with either from other people through interacting with other people, or also through interacting with technology. There you go. It's in the chat. And so obviously, as a child or as a person interacts with others and interacts with technology, that those things that they can do on their own without help grows. And then therefore the zone of proximal development grows, and the things that they can't do gets a little bit smaller. And so this is how they cognitively develop. By interacting with technology and other people, they're able to grow the things that they can do, those skills that they develop that are cognitive. The term Vygotsky uses for this assistance is called scaffolding. And Vygotsky says that the key way that the interaction occurs, the scaffolding occurs between interaction, is language. Language is the key way that that interaction occurs, that scaffolding can be provided. Yeah, scaffolding is just the assistance that others, that those more knowledgeable others are providing children as they develop cognitive skills. It's just basically the help, but it's a really fancy name. Now, Vygotsky says that because children don't have perfect language skills on their own, he has 3 stages of language that he discusses. So, when a child first develops language, the first stage is being able to just speak out loud, to speak to others and to interact with others. And this is, of course, how they begin to learn from others through this interaction. In stage 2, a child then has self-talk, where now they begin to talk to themselves. They begin to talk through their cognitive processes. I'm going to pick up the cup, and then I'm going to drink out of it, and then I'm going to make my imaginary doll friend drink out of the cup too. They say everything, but it's talking to themselves, and it's a way for them to kind of narrate what's happening or what they're doing, their cognitive thoughts that they're having. These are 3 stages of language that Vygotsky says as children learn cognitive skills. You're welcome. And it's this language that they use to interact with others and grow those cognitive skills. We haven't got to the 3rd stage just yet. So the first stage is just verbal out loud talk. The second stage is self-talk. And the 3rd stage is silent self-talk. And silent self-talk is used primarily for self-regulation. Whereas in the previous stage, they might say, oh no, I shouldn't steal that cookie. I'm going to get in trouble. Now, when they're in the 3rd stage, they can just think, oh no, I better not drink. I better not steal that cookie because I'm going to get in trouble. So social talk, self-talk, and silent self-talk. And that's basically like your inner monologue, right? You think to yourself, but you think in like your own voice, you know? You think, oh, I shouldn't do that. Or you have this kind of like inner conversation with yourself when you're trying to make decisions or solve problems. All right. Questions here. Josh, if you hear someone else's voice, it's schizophrenia or potentially hallucinogenic drugs. All right. That's the last of the 9 vote things. So now we're going to get into things that had 8 votes. And in research methods, there is nothing with 8 votes. Wow. Okay. And in learning, there is nothing with 8 votes. And in development, there's nothing with 8 votes. Okay, so we're going to skip the ones with 8 votes because there are none of them. Oh, I know you're making a joke. That's why I responded with kind of joking like that, Josh. All right, so let's look at the 7 vote ones. All right, there are a lot of 7 vote ones, and so we're going to kind of just work our way through them. We have a number of them in research methods, a few of them in the early schools, and then also things like the scientific method and operational definitions and replication, along with scatter plots and correlation coefficient. All right, so let's go through all this stuff. Structuralism was the first early school of psychology. By the way, if you get more than 2 or 3 questions about the early schools of psychology, I will be shocked out of 100. So Just so you know, there may be a question on careers in psychology. It's something that I had you guys read, but we really didn't cover it in class because honestly, it takes a long time and there's not a whole lot of value. You might have one question, one multiple choice question about careers. So you may want to just glance through that chapter a little bit. But ultimately, there's not going to be a lot. Uh, Structuralism is the first. Wilhelm Wundt was the guy who creates psychology. He is a German scientist in Hamburg. And along with his American protege, Edward Titchener. And I'll write the last names in the chat. And along with his protege, Edward Titchener, what they want to do is find out the structure of people's thoughts. So what they do is they have them do really basic experiments, like a light turns on, then they press a button slightly later, or something like that. And they say, okay, so what were you thinking when you had to press the button? And so what there was a lot of introspection. The participants would have to like self-reflect on what their individual thoughts were as they performed that basic task. And therefore, by getting these kind of narratives of what those thoughts were, they were able to discern what they called the structure of the thought. All right, do you guys have any questions about that one? That's really kind of all you need to know about it. When we get to it, you might want to know the difference between structuralism and functionalism, but we're not there yet. Functionalism has less votes. All right, so we're going to do the scientific method, the main steps of the scientific method. And there are basically 3 primary steps to the scientific method. Now, a chemistry teacher would tell you differently because they would have the research part of it be split up into a bunch of different things. But there are 3 primary parts to the scientific method. The first is the hypothesis. Or sorry, I'm not the hypothesis. Here we go, false information again. The first is the theory. The second is the hypothesis. So the first is the theory. This is just an idea that someone who's carrying out an experiment wants to prove. The second is the hypothesis. And this is when the theory is turned into something a little bit more measurable. You got the if and then statements. If this happens, then that occurs. So it takes that theory and it turns into something that becomes then measurable with those if and then statements. And then there's the research. And the research is obviously when the experiment is carried out. And based on the results of that research, the experimenter will either confirm their theory, so that shows they're right, reject their theory, which shows they're wrong, or revise their theory, which is change it a little bit based on the data that they see, and then readjust the hypothesis and research from there. So most experiments go through a number of different revisions. So they go through it, they get a set of data, they find out that it doesn't prove the hypothesis, but it also doesn't prove it wrong. So then they revise their theory slightly, which means they have to revise their hypothesis and revise their experiment slightly to then test out that new theory. All right, questions there about the scientific method? Okay, good. All right, so the next is operational definition and replication. All right, so an operational definition, and this is really, really, really important because it doesn't occur every year, but most years one of the FRQs will ask you to do experimental design, which is obviously then create an experiment about some sort of concept. And the thing that why it's always there is because you can always design an experiment about any sort of topic. And so experimental design, which really starts with operational definition, is the way you see a lot of FRQs about it. So it's pretty important because it tends to show up quite a bit. So operational definition is when in your research or when you're doing your research and creating your experiment, you are incredibly specific on. Hold on 1 second. Quiet, Shadow. Sorry, guys. Oh, he's sad now because he doesn't. All right. So the operational definition is when so you're incredibly specific on what that independent and dependent variable is. If there's going to be like an experiment where the control group gets one thing at a certain level, then the experimental group gets another thing at that level, then we can say that, specifically, what's the difference of that level? If you have a measurement tool and let's say it's a survey, you may want to say it's a 20-question survey that has answers that range from strongly disagree to strongly agree on a 1 to 5 scale. By doing it that specifically, now there's a point to this. By doing it that specifically, what you can do is anyone can replicate your experiment. Anyone can do it again for themselves. So in many times in this experimental design thing, they're going to ask you to operationally define the independent variable or the dependent variable. When that happens, be specific. Operational definitions are meant to be specific because they're meant to allow for replication. So that someone else can do the experiment to test, like let's say you prove a new theory, well, someone else is going to run that same experiment to see if they get the same results. All right, questions about operational definition and replication? All right, good. Okay, the last one with 7 votes of the research methods unit is scatter plots and correlation coefficient. With scatter plots are the way of measuring whether or not something is correlated. One second, you guys. So with scatter plots, I may need to draw a graph, but let's go over correlation coefficients first. Correlation coefficients will be the score if something is either negatively correlated or positively correlated or not correlated at all. The closer one gets to either 1 or -1 shows a stronger correlation. So if it's closer to 1, it's a very strong positive correlation. If it's close to -1, it's a very strong negative correlation. If the number is closer to 0, then obviously it's going to be a weaker correlation. If the correlation coefficient is larger than 1 or less than -1, then you would say that it is not correlated at all. It means that it's a weak correlation. It's not nearly as strong. The closer you get to 1 or -1, the stronger the correlation is. All right, and when you show it visually with a scatter plot, sorry, I promise this, I think this is going to be the last time. When you show it visually as a scatter plot, it looks, come on, start the new whiteboard, there we go. It's very simple. So again, with correlation, if something is positively correlated, that means that as one variable goes up, the other variable goes up. And when shown visually, it looks kind of like this. And obviously the data points are going to be all over the place here. I can't make little points. But the general correlation trend will show that the scores, as one variable goes up, so does the other. And this obviously is shown by, on the scatter plot, by a trend where the data points kind of go up and towards the right. Now, we should also remember that negative correlation is still good. It doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It just shows that the correlation is different than the positive correlation. Negative correlation kind of looks like that. Sorry. With data points all over the place. The general trend looks that way because it suggests that as one variable goes up, the other goes down. When they're asking if something is positively or negatively correlated, if you don't have a graph, you might want to make one. And when you make the graph, look closely at the variables, because sometimes they're really tricky in the questions that they ask. Like, I think I even put this on one of your guys' exams, which was the question of like, what's the correlation coefficient of an experiment that looked at the effect of sleep deprivation on test scores? Well, if you just saw sleep on test scores, you could say that the more sleep you get, the better you do on the test, right? That's positive correlation. Except when you're talking about sleep deprivation, that's not the same thing. That means the more sleep deprivation you have, the worse you'll probably do on the test, showing that then is negatively correlated. No, you're not. You're not going to be asked to draw a graph. These are generally just going to be part of multiple choice questions. I suppose it's possible. I think they've had it every once in a while. They do ones where they have in an FRQ where they have you like draw out a scatter plot or draw out a histogram. My guess is that for the digital versions, they won't. But even if they do, it's just they have all the tools for it anyway. Because they do. Other exams definitely use a lot of drawing. All right, and then obviously, if there is no trend, if the data points are just all over the graph, then we could say it's not correlated at all. All right. Does anybody have any questions about that? Besides the one that was just asked? Okay, good. All right, so let's go into learning. Yes, there's one thing in here with 7 votes, and that's classical conditioning. All right, so classical conditioning is stimulus and response learning. With classical conditioning, there are 5 distinct variables that take place in every form of classical conditioning. The first is what you would call the US, the unconditioned stimulus. This is some sort of stimulus. Now, let's remember what a stimulus is. A stimulus is something that stimulates your senses. So it's a sight, it's a sound, it's a taste, touch, or smell. And an unconditioned stimulus is some sort of stimuli that causes some sort of natural unlearned response. This natural unlearned response can be a behavior. Like if I clap really close to your face and the wind hits your eyelashes, you're most likely going to blink. But it can also be a feeling too, like fear, like emotions. If we think about the little Albert experiment, his unconditioned response was fear. So the UR, that second variable, is the unconditioned response. And this is the unlearned response to a stimuli. So something that is naturally occurring. A neutral stimulus is obviously some sort of stimulus that causes no response on its own. But this is why classical conditioning is in a form of an associative learning, because your brain unconsciously makes an association between that neutral stimulus and the unconditioned one. So when the two are paired together, the brain begins to make a connection between the one that doesn't need to be learned and the one that normally wouldn't cause any effect. And then once that unconditioned stimulus is removed, if that neutral one causes the same response, now conditioning has occurred. And when that happens, now the neutral stimulus is no longer neutral, right? Now it causes a response. So now it's been conditioned, and the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. In classical conditioning, the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are the exact same thing, except what it's coming from, what stimulus it's coming from. So, like in the little Albert experiment, where the unconditioned response was fear from the steel hammer, the conditioned response was fear from the rat. All right, questions about classical conditioning? The CS is the conditioned stimulus, is that neutral one once it causes that same response. So it's when the unconditioned one is removed, when the US is removed, and now that neutral stimulus, the NS, causes that same response. Now the NS is no longer neutral. Now it's conditioned, and now because it's causing that response. And the CR would be the response from the new stimulus. You're welcome. Okay, good. All right. There is one more with 7 votes. So we're going to hit it now. And it's Freud's 5 stages of psychosexual development. So this is the weird one. All right. So with Freud's 5 stages of psychosexual development, basically what Freud said is that as a child develops, the id, that unconscious part, that primal violent sexual part of their unconscious, fixates on a part of their body. And as it fixates on that part of the body, they develop certain behaviors that kind of connect to that part of the body. He calls these parts of the body erogenous zones, and these are essentially sexual zones for an adult. And that's why he said it's the id doing it. It's that primal part. Even though the kid doesn't know it, that primal part is still focusing on some of the sexual zones of a person. So stage 1 is called the oral stage. And this is where the id is fixating on the mouth. And this is where a child starts putting things in their mouth and develops in what Freud calls an oral fixation, where they constantly want to put things in their mouth and explore things in their mouth. Piaget would call it sensory motor, but Freud calls it oral fixation. Freud says that if a child doesn't learn to like use their mouth properly, they may have issues with speaking later on, like public speaking. They may have issues with smoking, or even drinking or things like that, because it all involves the mouth. So if they don't negatively kind of come to this resolution in this stage, if they don't resolve this unconscious focus on the mouth, then it's going to lead them to problems with the mouth later on in life. There we go. Right, Josh? There you go. All right. Stage 2 is referred to as the anal stage. And obviously, in the anal stage, this is when the id, that unconscious primal part, is focusing on the butt. And so, certainly, if Freud really says that he sees this through the ideas of toilet training. And, certainly if some parents cause their kids to be, to have to be really strict about how they do toilet training and things like that, then they're going to eventually become anal retentive, which is like fixated on the details and the organization, or fixated on the step by step instructions of how to do things. Freud also says there's another one called anal explosive, which always makes me laugh. Um, and it's basically this idea that if the parents don't toilet train their kid properly, then they'll be, super disorganized and, not really caring about structure and things like that in later in life. The third phase is really weird. It's the big weird one. And the third phase is the what he calls the phallic stage. I'm going to spell that. Uh, and the phallic stage uh, is when the id focuses on, well, the reproductive organ. Let's just say that. Freud says that you can see this in a couple of different ways. You can see this one as kids learn and explore their own bodies, eventually getting to their reproductive organs. But he also says that this is when a kid develops, especially a boy, will develop what's called the Oedipus complex, which is the really, really weird one and kind of gross. Not kind of gross, really gross. The Oedipus complex, in the short version of it, is uh, when the boy's id begins to develop some sort of sexual feelings for the mother. Now, this is unconscious, Freud says. And then will also develop a rivalry with the father. And will often emulate and imitate the father in order to be more like him because he's the person with the mother. Freud also says there's a female version of it too called the Electra complex, which is just basically the same idea. But Freud also liked to say that the girl during the Electra complex would feel intimidated by her father, by her father's social power, and then therefore he called it penis envy. I didn't make this up, so there you go. Stage 4 is the latent stage, and that's when the id goes dormant and the child begins to focus primarily on cognitive skills. And then finally, we have stage 5. And stage 5 is the genital stage. And this is when a child reaches physical sexual maturity during puberty. And then at that point is able to have conscious sexual thoughts, which shows that using like morality, they're going to be doing the right thing. Or if they don't do the right thing, then certainly they will have, unhealthy relationships in the future. This is where the id is no longer, where the thoughts that come from the id are no longer unconscious, but now become conscious as a child reaches physical sexual maturity during puberty. I know, right? That's really funny. Okay, questions about Weirdo Freud? All right, good. We have about 15 minutes, so I'm going to hit the speed round, okay? Everyone good? No worries, Logan. We're doing speed round now. So we're now at the topics that had 6 votes. I'm going to go quickly through this stuff. All right, in research methods, good. I'm glad we got 6 votes for this. We have the quasi-experiment. A quasi-experiment is like an experiment in that it has an independent and dependent variables, but the groups will lack random assignment. So this would be a type of experiment where you're like, the boys are going to get this variable and get the control variable, and the girls are going to get the experimental change. So the boys become the control group, the girls become the experimental group. So you can look at the differences between what happens to each group, but it has to be known that some of the results will come from the differences within the groups. So quasi-experiments show some really important things, but aren't as strong as a normal experiment because that some of the results are going to come from the differences in the group. All right, questions here? All right, the illusory correlation is when we see things that we think are correlated because we can use our observational skills. But if we actually tested them out, we would find that they're not. That even though it appears that something is correlated, without going through a correlational study and having results show that correlation, it doesn't necessarily make it correlated. Like kids with sugar, right? We know that sugar does not cause hyperactivity in children. It's been proven on a number of occasions. There is no correlation, even though it seems like there is. Or that rain and cold weather will cause you to catch a cold. It's not the cause of the cold. The virus is the cause of the cold. But because the rain and the cold can weaken your immune system, making you more susceptible to the virus, it appears that the two are correlated. All right, going through learning the things with 6 votes. All right, we got the reinforcement schedules. We're going to go fast through this one. There are 4 reinforcement schedules. By the way, continuous reinforcement, really, really weak types of conditioning. Because if it's always going to happen, if they're always going to be reinforced, then the moment that it isn't there, you don't see that behavior. So that's just a little bit side note with continuous reinforcement. Reinforcement schedules we have ratios and we have intervals. Ratios refer to the number of times that a behavior has to occur before reinforcement happens. A fixed ratio is when there's a specific set number of occurrences that a behavior occurs before reinforcement happens. The best example, buy 9 of these things, get the 10th one free, right? The desired behavior is that you buy the thing. So you buy it 9 times. That's the desired behavior. You're reinforced on the 10th one. Every time it's after 10. A variable ratio is when you're reinforced at random number of occurrences between each of the behavior. So like a slot machine, for example, is a perfect one for this one here. A slot machine, you pull it once, you might win. Then you might pull it 10 times. And then on the 10th time, you might win. Then you might pull it 3 times. And after the 3rd one, you might win. The winning is the reinforcement. The behavior is obviously that you keep pulling it. A fixed interval is when reinforcement occurs after a specific amount of time. Is that the most effective variable ratio? Yeah, probably. I would say yes. Because then it always might be that next one, which is why gambling is so addictive. All right, so a fixed interval is when the reinforcement occurs after a specific amount of time. You do the desired behavior, and no matter what you do after a certain amount of time, reinforcement happens. When you get a paycheck for doing your job, that is fixed interval reinforcement. The desired behavior is that you do your job, and you get reinforced every 2 weeks, or every week, or every month. But it's about time, not how often you do the behavior. And then obviously a variable interval reinforcement schedule is when you get reinforced after random periods of time. Fishing, by the way, is a really good example of variable interval reinforcement. You put that fishing rod in, and you might catch a fish in 5 minutes, or it might take you 5 hours. Questions here? Okay. That's it for the 6-vote ones on learning. Let's do the 6-vote ones on development. We have 2 of them. We have Mary Ainsworth's study on attachment. So this one's a pretty quick one. Mary Ainsworth wanted to see how kids could be attached to their parents, specifically to their mothers. So she brought kids and their mothers into her laboratory, which was essentially just a playroom. And she had the mothers sit with the kids initially, and she observed what occurred then. Then she had the mother leave for 15 minutes. And these are like 1-year-old kids, which is a long time for a 1-year-old. And then the mother returned. And so we have 3 types of attachment that are shown in this experiment. The first is the secure attachment. In the secure attachment, when the mother is there, the child will be near them. They might be touching them. But certainly, they're not like off on their own and doing their own thing. When the mother leaves, the child's upset. And when the mother returns, the child is happy. The second one is insecure avoidant attachment. Insecure avoidant attachment is when the mother came in, the child would avoid her, would be off doing their own thing. When the mother left, the child wouldn't care. And when the mother returned, the child wouldn't care. They would still be off doing their own things. So they have an avoidant attachment because there is no intimacy there. There is no closeness. And then finally, we have the ambivalent attachment. And in the ambivalent attachment, the child was incredibly clingy to the parent, to the mother when she came in. When the mother left, the child went absolutely nuts. And when the mother returned, the child rejected them. as a way to kind of be like a, not a revenge, but like a screw you for leaving me type thing. All right, the other study that we have here that got 6 votes is Diana Baumrin's study on parenting styles. With parenting styles, there are 3 primary parenting styles, though one of them you can kind of like split into 2. Uh, you have the authoritarian parenting style, where that's the parents that are like, my house, my rules, you better follow them. Obviously, that one's really good for structure, but not so good for social development because it's really rigid and doesn't allow for flexibility. You have the permissive parenting style, and that's where the parent lets the kid do whatever they want. This obviously can be pretty good for social development, but obviously really bad for developing structure and organization in a person's life. This can be both as a result of being neglectful, like the parent doesn't care, or because the parent wants to be like their best friend. And then you have an authoritative parenting style. And an authoritative parenting style is when you have a combination, a mix between the two. And that's obviously the best because you get some flexibility and independence, which allows for social skills, and also some structure, which allows for, good, personal and individual development. All right, just in these last 5 minutes, I'm going to hit the ones with 5. There aren't that many of them. The first one that I'm going to hit is functionalism, and I really wanted to hit this one so that we can compare it to structuralism. So, functionalism is the second early school of psychology started by William James. And with functionalism, what William James wanted to look at is how different types of thoughts and how different behaviors were functional for human beings as a species. So William James was big into Darwin. This is really connected to evolution. And he said, with other species, their physical characteristics will win out, survival of the fittest, and that whole thing. What about with humans? Why do humans have this way of behaving? Why do humans have this way of thinking? What is the function of it? How did it help with the survival of the human species? So obviously, both are looking at the thought process between structuralism and functionalism. But while structuralism is looking at the breakdown of what makes up the thought, functionalism is looking at what's the purpose of the thought. All right. A meta analysis is a type of research method that looks at a number of different studies, combines their results to get one overarching conclusion. All right. The locus of control is another 5 vote one. And the locus of control is basically when you learn where you think, like where outcomes happen, where they come from, outcomes that happen to you. If you have an internal locus of control, you will learn to have this perspective that everything is due to your own actions, both the good and the bad. If you have an external locus of control, it's things outside of you, things like fate or I was part of this group and therefore it was out of my control. And it's something outside of you that causes that specific thing to occur. All right, and the last one that I'm going to hit tonight is Harry Harlow's studies on attachment in monkeys. So Harry Harlow was a researcher that looked at the idea of physical attachment. And what he did is he separated baby monkeys from their mothers. It's super unethical experiment, by the way. And he had these baby monkeys have both a what he called the wire mother and the cloth mother. The wire mother was a bunch of wires shaped like a monkey, and it had a feeding bottle. And the cloth mother was like a blanket with like a stuffed monkey head on the top. And he wanted to see whether or not it was physical touch or physical nourishment that created attachment in species. What he found is that these baby monkeys clung to the cloth mothers, showing that physical touch was the primary way that attachment developed between parent and child. He also did a few other things. One really unethical thing where he separated the baby monkey from any sort of parental figure, even the wire or cloth mother, to see what would happen without that maternal or paternal support. And all those monkeys needed to be euthanized because they like experienced extreme stress reactions and wouldn't mate. And if they did mate, and if the mothers did get pregnant, then the mothers would like just abandon their children too. It was really, really terrible and sad. Um, but what this proved, the main part of it, is what he proved is that physical touch was necessary for attachment, much more than nourishment. All right, it is 8:01. How's everybody feeling? We covered a lot. Good. Do you guys feel like that was worthwhile? You're not bad. Well, you also missed part of it. Andrew from note taking. Um, okay, good. Did you guys feel that was helpful? Did I clear a lot of things up for you guys? Is there any topic? Good, good, good. I'm really glad. And that's the whole purpose of this whole thing. Is there any topic that somebody, even though it was in the lower vote ones, somebody absolutely needs this one topic covered that I can cover in like a minute or two? Okay. Well, then in that case, I think that this is where we're going to stop because 2 hours is a long time, and you guys have done really well, and hopefully this was really beneficial. And yeah, that's it. So that's where we're going to stop. Obviously, if you have an individual question about a topic, just send me an email. I will. You're welcome very much. Very much. You're welcome. I'm glad this was so helpful for you guys, and that's really the purpose. So if you do have an individual question, please send me an email, and I will try to respond as quickly as I can to get you that information of a topic or something that you're kind of not clear on. So, but other than that, this is where we're going to call it a night. And you are